Everybody, welcome to Good Tech, an ongoing discussion about ethics and technology. I'm Elizabeth Perry with Idka. Today we're going to talk about a movement taking place right now, or as today's guest terms it, an awakening to digital privacy. Shouldn't we have the same rights in our digital world as we do in our physical one? We've touched on this subject before, but recent news suggests it's a conversation that needs to continue. Our guest today is a veteran in tech and in the business of privacy, strategist, journalist, author, editor, and commentator. Please welcome MITCH RATCLIFFE.
Nice to be here.
All right, so MITCH, little time has gone by when you look at the grand scheme of things between the birth of the internet, the well, which nobody knows what that is anymore, but maybe we could explain a little bit to the newbies. And now, so much has happened in technology. So we've got lots to talk about. You are one of the pioneers. You've seen tech from the early days, before social media, before our lives became so wrapped up in the digital world we live in now. So looking back on your life and the tech industry, when did you start caring about digital privacy? What's the story?
Well, first, thanks, Liz, for having me on the show. It's an honor to be here. My relationship with technology was one of a very transitional generation. I grew up with a typewriter, and I could not figure out why everybody wanted to use these incredibly complicated computers to produce the same thing I could type. I kept taking them back until I got a Macintosh and a modem and logged into what you mentioned a few minutes ago, the well. And what I discovered there, without trying to explain it all first, is a group of people, many of them very influential early web folks, who were exploring a lot of ideas about privacy and social relationships online in the well, which was the Whole Earth Electronic Link, a bulletin board and actually a full operating system that you could mess with that launched in the 80s. It was founded by Stuart Brand and the folks who were around the Whole Earth catalog. And the conversations in there were fascinating and laid the basis for physical relationships that have changed the industry all over the well. Partnerships and relationships were formed that later turned into companies and movements. Amongst others, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is well known now as one of the leading advocates of privacy. So I kept sending my computers back. I hooked up to the well, and I realized this thing wasn't a typewriter; it was a phone. And that was the moment I saw into what was going to happen, and started to be concerned about how it was going to change our interactions as well. Since I was a publisher and worked as a reporter at the time, the conversations themselves were great ways to source stories, the great ways to collect more information, tap into expertise that would have been unavailable anywhere else. But it was also clear, even at that time, that you could move a conversation well off its natural trajectory with digital interventions. And so we had trolls back then too. We just didn't call them trolls. Many of the human experience kind of elements of our recent history feel new, but they're repetitions in a different key of previous interactions and social mores. And so without trying to make it sound like, I'm telling this story about Grandpa who settled the West.
It wasn't that long ago.
But it was a little bit like that. And actually, relatively speaking, we're talking about the 1980s. In the 1880s, that was the closing of the West. It closed in 1890. And to some extent, we did repeat it again 100 years later with this new space, which was dubbed cyberspace. There's actually an article this week in the New York Times declaring the death of cyberspace, which was a concept involving a set of liberties that was espoused by John Perry Barlow, an early well participant and also a good friend of mine during his life. And John had declared a sort of declaration of the rights of humanity in cyberspace in 1996 at a series of speeches in Europe. And I happened to have been sitting in the third row at one of those. And I admire John's boldness, but it was always an idealistic view of the web that we were talking about. One in which, as you said at the beginning, had to do with renegotiating what kinds of rights and responsibilities we have in the digital space. And we also tend to focus mostly on rights rather than the responsibilities when we talk about this. And I think we have to take them both. You earn rights with the exercise of responsibility. So we need to be looking at how we communicate, whether we're communicating honestly, transparently, that is, are we representing ourselves to be who we are? The slogan and basic operating rule of the well was you own your own words. And that had two meanings. One is you retain the rights to what you said in the well. You weren't ceding them by publishing them in that space. And the other was that you had to stand up and take the consequences of what you said, and to do it politely and not turn it into an ugly fight. And that isn't to say that there weren't ugly fights. There were plenty of ugly fights, but we all at least were trying to be civil and trying to build something that, and this was John Barlow's formulation, a small town on the Western frontier. In fact, he even wrote an early essay about the well, and his depiction was it of him sitting with his cowboy boots up on the tie rail in front of the building, and somebody rides into town, and it's a stranger, and you ask them questions, and your world opens up. And I found that to be true with the well all the time. I would get to know somebody's mind online and then meet them in person, and a lot of folks would end up collaborating. I worked with Mitch Kapoor, the founder of Lotus Development Corporation, Lotus 123, the spreadsheet application, on a series of columns for Forbes back then. And he ended up starting the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I was the catalyst for the Electronic Frontier Foundation San Francisco membership group. We started it in the offices of MacWeek after work on Thursdays. And I think the EFF is representative of some of the kinds of challenges we have. They decided after chapters sprung up in San Francisco, Austin, Texas, and New York, that they didn't really want chapters. They didn't want to be a grassroots organization. They wanted to focus on the legal issues. And so they became a national organization and sort of eschewed these local membership groups. So centralization of power and centralization of influence has been an ongoing theme in the digital world since the very beginning. Now, my trajectory, once I got past being on the well, I ended up in technical writing and doing tech reporting for MacWeek, and ran Digital World, a Siebold report, which was a very influential newsletter back then. And as a result, I also ended up being introduced into the world of startups, and was on the founding board of directors at Match.com, which was really the first platform marketplace where it was the connection between people that was for sale. There were a lot of challenges in figuring out how to monetize that at Match.com, but we were selling connections just like a Maven would today with dating online. We've seen that it's become a specialized, personalized service, like a concierge service. And that concierge service idea is something that I think is representative of where we're going, and also what will be involved in the trading of our personal information, or the use of our personal information to get better results out of the world around us. So I had been involved with a lot of different technology companies, and I'm also now working on sustainability as a topic, along with privacy. Privacy and sustainability are going to go together very deeply, because as we build out a deeper uh, technological sensor environment that's able to measure more of what we do and how we do it. We should be owning that information in the sense that the well talked about. We should own the information for purposes of trading and working with others. And ownership is a problematic word when I say that. And we should own what we've done in terms of our responsibility to society and otherwise. And we tend only to focus on the rights part rather than the responsibilities, as I said earlier. So watching that change over the years has been interesting. And as I look at the evolution of the circular economy, that is where materials go from raw materials to product to end of life, and then are captured and reused in another generation. And hopefully you wean yourself off using virgin materials and just use recycling or recycled materials. But to do that, companies need to have a logistics systems tracking that material all through the economy, which means through our lives as well. And we have to find out how, through a long debate that we have yet to be really, we're just beginning with these kinds of conversations, how we're going to use that shared insight into the world around us that's made up of all our activity to optimize the economy so we get everything that we need to live well and to maintain our lifestyles to the best degree we can. And I mean that in the competitive economic sense, not in we're doomed, we're not going to be able to, we're all going to live in grass huts because there's going to be no power. But we have to be ready to find ways to share certain information and to maybe have it evaporate once it's done serving its purpose in our relationship. Maybe it's a matter of using blockchain and counting every little transaction and toting it up at the end of the day to see whether or not you're more wealthier or more private or some other measure. We don't know. But it's a matter of negotiation, and that negotiation is just starting.
Yeah, the negotiation. So that brings up a whole host of other things, because the question is who decides, who negotiates, who makes the decisions on what's right, what's wrong. I mean, is it in the corporate hands? Is it in the government hands? Is it who's having this conversation? I guess that's sort of a big question. But
well, the conversation's been going on since the early 90s, but of course it's getting larger and more diverse. Ultimately, the internet is a product of a combination of private enterprise, but mostly of government investment. And as a result, it did grow up around a set of strongly defined standards that allowed us to communicate efficiently, not very richly, but efficiently back in the 80s and 90s. As the commercial web appeared, and that was in 1993, 94, we started layering new technologies on top of those standards, and those have created a whole series of walled gardens. And the early walled gardens were AOL and CompuServe. Those were both dial-up services, and the dial-up connection itself was the wall. You had to have a membership to get inside AOL or get inside CompuServe or Yahoo at that point too. And as more and more of those technological proprietary interfaces took control of the net, corporations had greater and greater say, to the point where today Facebook is, in some sense, largely in control of our social interaction without any real accountability. But this goes back to governments having set the example, I think. And I was a reporter, as I said, and I broke a couple of stories back in the 90s. One was on, both John Markoff and I got this within the same day. He was with the New York Times at the time. The Clipper chip was we discovered that there was a back door, that is an algorithmic door that you could open in the encrypted content that the Clipper chip was purported to provide. Which was supposed to be secure. And this was a backdoor placed in there by the NSA. And we found the proof of that and published this in, let's say 1992 or 93. And John and myself and others pointed to this as an example of how our lives could become surveilled pretty easily because we were simply connecting to all these things rather than thinking through the implications of the connections. So we found that, tried to raise the alarm, and not many people were concerned because not that many people use the internet, and no one was really thinking about it as a problem. They saw it kind of as a solution instead of the question of how much advertising is effective. And since money drives a lot of what is seen and viewed on the internet, that dominated the discussion. So the government set the example of opening a back door. They also did another project that I was involved with reporting was called the U.S. card. And the U.S. card was a project of the United States Postal Service is essentially going to be a digital identity card that would allow you to prove you were yourself, but also potentially pay your taxes and do all these other things. But it turned out that the NSA, the National Security Agency, was involved in that too. And the basic hashing algorithm to secure content, MD5, is compromised as well. And we reported that back in that time frame. And the Postal Service and the White House, which were the Clinton White House, which was involved in this, took the project off the table after it was uncovered. Mm-hmm. But again, they'd set the stage for this notion of, okay, well, it's flowing through something we get to watch. And that has only become more and more pressing as time has gone on. Apple and Microsoft fought back against the early imposition of backdoors. Mm-hmm. Apple has remained the most true to it, although I think Microsoft's starting to understand and to return to some of those roots as well. By the way, it worked for them, so take it with a grain of salt. Worked, past tense. Not that I don't like them. So we've always had a sense, and there's always been a kind of casual disregard of the fact that that we're being surveilled. And the argument is often in the case of, well, do you really do anything you have to be concerned about? Like you're going to go to prison. But when you're talking about taking your data exhaust, all this information that describes what you're doing, it's like being in Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, which was a prison designed to be monitored by as few people as possible so that one guard could watch everybody down different corridors. And marketing technology has tended to flow in the Panopticon direction, where because I'm in there, I am freely being observed, and the argument is that they're serving up exactly what I want. Well, we've seen what that does when you get into thought bubbles, and certainly the Russians have taken full advantage of our ability to hive off into factions and argue about stuff. The Russian interference in the election isn't toward any particular end that I can tell. I mean, they obviously favored Trump to some extent, but what they really are trying to do, and what they continue to try to do, is disrupt our democracy in the sense that they keep us from talking rationally to one another. And that's all they need to do in order to be effective, because it slows us down. It slows down our economy, and it slows down our government's ability to react strongly to their continued aggression in the Ukraine and other places.
Right.
But this whole world, as we connect it, particularly when we bring 5G, the next generation of wireless, into the picture, where you can have 1.2 million sensors or IP devices within 1 kilometer. So
yeah, that makes my head explode.
Right. But at the same time, imagine what we would know about how much waste there was. We throw away 45% of our food in this country. We could, by managing where it was going more efficiently, reduce that food waste entirely. We could reclaim and recapture a lot more material if we agreed to, at the end of the useful life, to send something back to the manufacturer so that they could recycle it and hold them accountable for recycling it. They'd have to report that back to us. And that's a situation where the transparency flips the equation in the positive and hopeful way that we were talking about back in the 90s. But like I said, Barlow's view of cyberspace was idealistic. It was idealistic then, and we live in a very real and economically driven world in which privacy has not been valued. And it's because ultimately, at the beginning of the day, our government said that our privacy was less important. And I should say that it was particularly the US government, not the European governments, because they have strong data protection privacy laws in place that have been there since the 1980s because they had the experience of World War II and the rounding up of many different peoples, but most notably the Jewish people, for slaughter and persecution. And so the U.S. took a casual capitalist first approach, and with all of the benefits of the accelerated pace of technical evolution, brought a lot of costs too. And now we're coming to terms with those.
So, you touched on government, democracy, and I'm particularly intrigued by your book that you wrote in 2001, if I'm not mistaken.
5.
Was it 2005?
Yeah, because Howard Dean ran in
Democracy?
2004. Yes. Yes.
Okay, well, I read wrong. You have to shout at Amazon because it's up written in 2001, but it was with John Lebkowski and a bunch of other people, and you co-edited this with him. Tell us a little bit about that. It was way ahead of its time. It talks about the impact of technology on democracy.
Well, so that book came out of a group of people who were involved to varying degrees in the Howard Dean campaign in 2004, which was really the first to effectively use digital fundraising. And if you don't recall the Howard Dean campaign, the most important thing they did in terms of using the net was reverse the troll effect. Whenever somebody would show up and start bad-mouthing Howard Dean on the site, Howard Dean's team would put up a graphic of a baseball bat that was like a temperature thermometer that you would fill with money. So they'd say, we're being attacked again. Let's raise $1 million. And they would fill the bat up incrementally with $1 million, which could happen in a day because this troll showed up. And so they used it as a catalyst to counteract that. And it was really powerful and achieved real results. Dean did not win the nomination. Dean was a flawed candidate in many ways in retrospect, but he did it first. And we also know that the Obama campaign in 2008 and certainly the Trump campaign in 2016 have capitalized on the availability of all this personal information in order to better target us as citizens and influence our vote. As we digested what we learned from Howard Dean, John and I decided to put together a book about what we had learned in the campaign, but we drew on authors who had participated in various aspects of the campaign. So in particular, Joey Ito, who is now the director of the Media Lab at MIT, was one of our contributors. We had Zephyr Treachet, who is now, I believe, running for Attorney General of New York, and others writing about what they had learned. And my particular takeaway, and I am frankly a small d Democrat, in the sense that I believe everybody does need to be involved and vote in order to make our democracy and our society a rich and rewarding one to participate in, was that I feel like people, given these tools, still can make a substantial difference. This isn't the idealistic, let's go change the world by marching. There are tools out there that we can change the flow of value. We can change the flow of our rights and of our responsibilities. And extreme democracy, the phrase, was coined specifically to combine the ideas of agile development, this notion of short sprints, rapid iteration that we were developing in the technology world, to political thinking. And so we said to ourselves, just as Margaret Mead did, any small group of people can make a huge difference if they're sufficiently motivated. Give them the tools and the motivation will come. Was it naive? No, I don't think so. But I think it was hopeful, and we saw a real opportunity to give people tools that have been used well and have been used badly. The badly side is what we recognize today as the social disruption that goes on around any ideological conversation, or the injection of ideology into any conversation. That prevents us from having real dialogue. And so with the Extreme Democracy book is always surprised me, is used in a number of college courses to explain the beginning of what happened in this phase of our history. I don't yet see a political movement that has embraced both the power of the net and the liberating influence of decentralization fully. And for instance, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is an example of that. They started off with a potential grassroots strategy, but they moved to a national strategy. Facebook is a completely centralized organization. Mark Zuckerberg, because of the structure of the company, is unaccountable to his shareholders as well as to all of his employees. He owns enough to tell them what to do. The same is true at Google. And that has given these organizations both a personality that emphasizes their singular control of their environment, and one in which you get pretty standard and repetitive stuff rather than in a richer variety of things that we might benefit from, hearing more stories of the real impact of the world on us. But what do we have instead? We have celebrities. Celebrities are now our avatars, and they suffer things for us and they experience joy for us. And then we talk about it. I think what we really need is for all of us to be connected and as engaged and well supported as a celebrity. But we'll get there.
So, all right. So let's get back to like the evolution of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Has it evolved, or have we backpedaled since the Electronic Frontier Foundation and others way back in 1990? I mean, let's face it, today our personal information is being bought and sold in ways that we don't even understand. I don't even understand. And I'm in the industry.
Yeah.
So how did we get here, and what's the evolution been like or is like now?
Well, we definitely evolved. I think we're singing the same tune in a different key. We had a different relationship with the world 35 years ago. We weren't instantaneously aware of everything going on in the world around us. We were instantaneously aware of what was going on in our community.
Right.
And so now we have all sorts of things that we can get upset about and get concerned about on a day-to-day basis that may be halfway or all the way around the world. And in a lot of ways, that's taken our eye off the local opportunity, which is where the real organizational benefits are going to come into play. We can reshape every level of our economy by using these tools. The question is, what do we need to share? And does that mean we have to give it away and lose control of it in terms of our personalization in order to enjoy the benefits of this economy? And the assumption, and this is, I think, best articulated in 2 books right now. Shoshana Zuboff did a book called The Surveillance Economy. I believe you're going to hold it up now.
I'm going to show you that right now, everybody.
It's a big, thick book, too.
It's bigger than my head. I can't quite get it in the screen.
Well,
Tony, you get that? Yeah.
It's bigger than my head because I still don't fully understand everything she's written. But Shoshana's been writing about technology now for quite a long time. She's a professor at Harvard. And she argues that Google, when it figured out that it had information for connecting people based on expressed interests, revolutionized its business and the entire internet business. It changed the direction of the flow of personal information, not toward us so that we were aggregating it, but away from us so that it was being stripped away from us. And the visual image that I would suggest people think about is that a mountain in, say, the Alleghenies that's been stripped down to get to the copper inside. We are being strip mined of our personal information the way that the natural resources of the physical world that were necessary for the industrial revolution were stripped away, and we're now paying the consequences for that. If we don't start to come to terms with the way that we are treating people as simple commodities who produce information that other organizations can buy, own, and manipulate, we end up in what Shoshana Zuboff calls a surveillance economy, where you have the impression that as the controller of the system, whether it's Facebook or Google, that your algorithms know better than your customers. And that can be perceived as true because, wow, you made a good recommendation. That's actually something they're interested in. But you can also see in the fact that it doesn't function very well. And I would point to this very practical example. Go buy something or shop for something on Amazon and then see how many times you see that same product offered to you on sites across the web.
Yeah.
And in my case, I bought a number of shirts a while back, and I'm still getting shirt ads, and it's like, why? I bought 10
Why?
shirts.
I already have the
I have
shirt.
10 shirts. What do I need? And so they only see that as a signal that I like shirts rather than that I'm now fully stocked with shirts, probably for another 5 to 10 years. And that treats me wrong. That's what we're talking about here. It treats me as a consuming maw, just like a hole you pour products into, and then you probabilistically analyze whether or not I'm going to like it. And that's marketing today. We are at a point where we could take marketing and do something much more interesting with it, but it would also involve some kind of exchange of information that we have the power to selectively share. And today, it's just all on or all off. You block ads, you block cookies, that you can create exception rules, but all that management is on you. And what you want it to be is on the organizations, in the sense that they should know how to handle my data, because I have rules about what you can do with my data, but I also have benefits I'm looking for that I'm willing to trade some data for. So it's the ability to say anonymously, and this is something that the Idka platform is allowing us to do now too, to have a completely private conversation, invite people or organizations in selectively, and then engage around a set of information, which, because it is in a controlled environment, you can say, now we've got some accountability. You've got this information. You need to deliver the following and report back whether it's really been done. So transparency on the part of the brands using the information, and accountability in terms of they're not then taking it and making 4 or 5 times more money by selling it to 3 other or 5 other or 10 other organizations that want the same information about me. That's not on the table in my rules. And that's the privacy expectation that we came from the industrial era into the digital era with. But it is changing because now we know so much more about what's going on in our lives. And because much of that happens through devices like this, the device owner, that is, because this is really Apple's property, I have licensed it. And I have an Android phone too. It's the same thing. I've licensed this phone, and it then becomes a sensor on Apple's behalf to help me be targeted for certain ads. They're very good about not targeting third-party ads, but when it comes to Apple, they know everything you're doing. And that is something we still have to keep in mind, even though they are the best of the best in terms of privacy. And so this notion of a slow reveal, like when you meet somebody socially. So we're back at the guy riding into town on the West. Where you been, stranger? What's your name? Can I buy you a drink? That all those social interactions led to an exchange of information where I knew now what was going on in Chisholm because he just rode in from there. But today, because I know what's going on all over the world, I can turn on any number of media sources and find out what's happening in any country right now. There's so much more to deal with, and I can get caught up in. But ultimately, it's about what we do locally to fulfill our needs, and whether that local action is sustainable in the sense that it's not doing harm to somebody else on the other side of the world. That could include pollution because we send trash there. It could be slave labor. And I want to know that that's not in the products I buy too. I don't want something made by slave labor. I don't want something that's destroying the rainforests in Borneo. And so that transparency and accountability could also be in service of me achieving my values. And that's where, as a privacy advocate, I recognize that privacy has to do with creating shared settings in which people act together towards shared goals. We call that community. We call that civilization. It's just been so fragmented that we have yet to put it back together in such a way that it feels like one coherent environment in which our privacy and our personal relationships, both between people and organizations, are governed by a reasonable and understandable set of common sense principles, or what we would call mores, and then reinforced by actual legal contracts that are simple and easy to use, not the kind of click and forget software wrapper agreements that are probably illegal at their very heart, that we have today. So privacy is evolving, but privacy is something that, like the idea of an aura, is changing, and even based on what surface it comes in contact with. Like when I deal with the government, I'm painfully aware of what the government knows about me. When I deal with a company, I don't know so much because it's very murky. That's the distinction that we're trying to deal with, and government led us into this by opening back doors. The U.S. government more than any other government, and corporations have followed and extended that manifest destiny kind of approach. Well, we're here and now we own it, to every aspect of our interaction with anything we touch. And that's where we need a selective disclosure process where I can, anonymously say, I have some interest in this. Well, now we've moved past some interest. I want to share some information to get a better outcome. And that might be, I'll use a sustainability example. I agree to buy organically grown food from a local farming collective. Now, I'm going to agree to give them my credit card information and tell them the things that I want, the fruits and vegetables I prefer. I want them to use that to get that to me, and I want them to be able to tell me that these were really organically grown products. That's the whole relationship. That's a well-gated and easily understood relationship. But in the I've signed away all my rights world that we live in, that could open up my data to being shared with 10 other organizations, like I was saying before. That's where we need to draw the line. Now, the other book that I mentioned to earlier is Zucked by Roger McNamee. And Roger is, there's Zucked, and that's Mark Zuckerberg's thumb crushing the planet. Roger, who is an old friend of mine, I remember him before he was Roger.
You remember him what?
I remember him before he was Roger McNamee, the guy who did this stuff. I remember meeting him in 1991 in a Chicago steakhouse at Macworld. And he was just a stock analyst at the time, but he's done such amazing things. And one of the things he did was become Mark Zuckerberg's primary advisor. And this is what the book is about. Early in the life of Facebook, there was an opportunity to sell it for about $1 billion. And Zuckerberg wanted somebody to, not so much talk him out of it, but to give him a reality check. And Roger went in and basically said, look, you're never going to get the chance to start from scratch again. If you're going to make it, come on, dogs, stop it. We have a new puppy and the older dog is not happy. So Roger said, you should stick with this. And please, dogs. Ridiculous.
This reminds me of that 60 Minutes. Was it a 60 Minutes thing where the guy's kids came into the room?
Yeah. My dogs are my annoying children.
It's awesome.
I like them. So he talked Zuckerberg out of getting rid of it, and he thought he saw a person who was going to really try to do something to change the shape of society, and certainly Zuckerberg did, but he didn't do it in any way that was good for the rest of society. And Roger is now a very severe critic of the Facebook business model. And in fact, one of the co-founders of Facebook today in the New York Times wrote an
I was just going to say that, yeah.
Calling for the breakup of the company because they have become far too influential and have more than a monopoly control over monetary exchange, but over ideas. And Roger's growing awakening to what he had helped create has driven him to become an activist on behalf of privacy awareness and privacy discussions. I don't think Roger is advocating, as Shoshana Zuboff does, a really aggressive approach to regulation of these companies, but because he does not feel that we end up in this kind of monotone, everybody wears the same jumpsuit environment that Shoshana projects. He thinks capitalism has real value, and I would be happy to debate that with people. I believe it does too, but there are too much of a good thing and too much of a bad thing are always bad things. And so Roger's trying to encourage a dialogue here in the United States amongst consumers about what they should reasonably share with others, particularly with companies, and that there be an awareness that these click to agree software wrapper agreements are essentially illegal. And so he's fighting to get that up the flagpole so everybody can take a good look at it. And it's curious, he was here in town for a speech about 5 weeks ago in Seattle. And he recounted the fact that he can go on Tucker Carlson and MSNBC with Rachel Maddow on the same day, talk about privacy, and both sides are incredibly angry about privacy. They have no difference of opinion about privacy whatsoever. They want their privacy. So this is what you would think of as a bridge topic from this riven present that we live in to something where we have some semblance of agreement about how to live together in the future. So how that will shape up and what that will look like is certainly something that we need to work to see. We can't just determine it and say, let's go there, because right now we don't have a full understanding of where we're going. But these all come back to what is the exchange that we make in the public space. Mm-hmm. And I won't go into the nature of public and private, but it has changed radically over the past 2,500 years. The home used to be public, and private activity was when you went out in public, like we talked about, and you had to be aware of the fact that you were breaching protocol, civilization's mores outside, not at home. And so I just started going into the history, and it's fraught with philosophical issues. But we are in the midst of trying to redefine what the limits of public and private are. And with the technology penetrating every aspect of our life, the assumption has been every aspect of our life is now public. That can't be the case. It'll drive us all clinically mad. We cannot manage that kind of uncertainty. So we're going to find some form of regulation. We may end up modifying our constitutions to do these things too. But when we do that, we're going to be creating out of a combination of thin air and technology new rules that we're going to have to live with for generations. And we know that hard and fast rules that last generations are very difficult to make successful. So we have to do this as an evolutionary process rather than as let's make a decision and we'll be done with it.
Right.
And that's why getting into environments, and I did a startup in 2008 that was focused on selective disclosure of personal information, and we were doing some really interesting work on it. It didn't succeed because it was too far ahead of its time, which is why I think Idka is interesting. But we had several brands that were perfectly willing to not know anything about their customers as long as their customers talked about certain things in an environment that they could advertise. So to some extent, we're just back to what the local newspaper was, which was news and information about the community you lived in, supported by advertisers within the community. The problem that we have today is that we've got multinational companies that no longer think about themselves as part of local communities where they're trying to do business with customers. And my argument, and this is what I do at Metaforce, which is a marketing firm, we provide advice and services, is to convince brands that living their brand requires transparency. And if they want to have intimate interactions with people, that transparency has to go all the way through to the customer at the local level so that they see what's being extracted from them and what they're getting for it in return. And this is also true in the millennial and Gen Z generations of the way they want to work. They want to work in businesses that are aligned with their values. So that transparency is going to be an internal problem too.
Right.
And that requires the companies open the kimono the way they've demanded we open the kimono ourselves. And I think once you have that on the table, when you say, look, you have to share if you want us to share, that's when the negotiation really starts. And that's right where we are.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's right where we are now.
I mean, is that what Doc Searls is talking about in his intention economy? I haven't read this book yet, but here's another book.
Yes, and Doc is another old friend. His Clue Train Manifesto back in 1999 with Chris Locke and two other authors, David Weinberg and Jim Stern, argued that all markets are conversations. And that was an incredibly influential book and changed the way a lot of people talked about things. The intention economy is more of a systematic view of the entire set of functions that produce our daily life. Mm-hmm. And Doc is talking in terms not only of, we talk about capturing people's attention, right, in marketing and advertising, but to understand their intention is a more intimate and in many ways respectful undertaking, because it requires real give and take, where right, I don't, as the marketer, say, well, this is what I have, take it or leave it. The way that we're moving with brands is it's okay, sign on and we will improve the product on an ongoing basis for you. So this is the idea of, personalized everything, manufacturing on demand, that it'll all be one thing for everybody. That's probably not possible at scale in our lifetimes, but we're headed that way. And that's the basis of this new interaction. Doc is saying that you should listen for the intention, and you should do it in a way that you're not mining or strip mining the people of the attention and information that they bring to those interactions. That if you did that respectful exchange, like a conversation in the street, you end up, or a sales call at retail or in somebody's home too. If you end up optimizing that using the information and not exploiting that information to make unrelated revenue, which puts the customer at risk of being surveilled by somebody else, you have a real opportunity to create a closely bound community around your brand who supports it and supports its values, because they are their values as well. So again, I am very interested in sustainability. Marketing of sustainable products now is at 16.6% of all consumer packaged goods products, according to an NYU study that came out last month. And they are growing 3.5 times faster than regular consumer packaged goods marketed the traditional way. That's where we have this interesting opportunity to move from attention to intention, where we gather rather than where we are drawn in. And Doc's challenge is, how do you articulate the notion of my information, information that was generated in collaboration with somebody else? I mean, for instance, my Apple Watch, I know all about my heart rate. I know all about my weight. I track what I eat. And it had real benefits for me. I lost 60 pounds with this thing. And I'll give it the credit because it made me aware of what I was doing. That's all it did. But that information is Apple's now too.
Right.
And so we have to figure out what that means and when can we share that information. And frankly, I don't know how it's going to turn out. Yeah.
So this is all like, I mean, we could have a whole show on respectful marketing. This is something that I'm incredibly interested in. As with Idka, we don't track, mm-hmm, and we don't use people's information, and we don't sell it, and
right,
it's not there. But anyway, so we only
have. But you can create a setting that allows that sharing of information under controlled circumstances, which again is it's the basis for agreements about interchange.
Right. So we only actually have a couple of minutes, and so we have to wrap things up, but I want to sort of, we talked a lot about a lot of things today, but we're kind of honing in on digital privacy.
Mm-hmm.
What do you want to leave the audience with? I mean, how are you going to get the people to understand the importance of digital privacy?
Well, two things. First off, consider yourself. Are you fully in control of everything about you? Are you that mountain that has had the whole top of it stripped away? Or are you the mountain and you interact with people on your own terms? I wouldn't want to be a strip mined mountain. Sounds overly simplistic, but that is literally what we're doing. And companies are not paying the cost of that acquisition that the long-term implications of those acquisitions of information imply are going to be there. We did that with the industrial era, and boy, are we paying for it now. We've got unclean garbage. We've got carbon dioxide overload in the atmosphere. We have to clean all this up. So it's an analogous situation where we are turning people into a commodity, and that's going to have deep consequences for decades to come. The other thing is, no one should think that they are powerless, because every time you spend money, you have the opportunity to create influence. And this is unfortunately a very transactional view, because at this point, there isn't a legal or ethical basis for these agreements. So we have to focus mostly on what it costs us and what we get back when we interact and share information with people. But our ability to make those decisions and communicate them in environments like Idka provides to people who are interested in learning to see whether or not there may be a relationship there, and then respectfully use that information to provide what I need and what they need so that we both come out better at the end of the day. A win-win proposition. I know that's so unpopular today, but it actually is very doable. So stick to your guns and keep the miners off your head.
All right. Hey, I have one last question for you, and it's a yes or no.
Okay.
Will you come back? Because we didn't have enough time to get anywhere like close to.
I'd be happy to. Yes. I'm recording this so that you can hold me to it.
All right. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Good Tech, Mitch. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you again. We'll see you again. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day.